Ancient America in Notes on American Archaeology by John D. Baldwin. Part 5, Mexico and Central America continued. To understand the situation and historical significance of the more important antiquities in southern Mexico and Central America, we must keep in view their situation relative to the great unexplored forest to which attention has been called. Examine carefully any good map of Mexico and Central America, and consider well that the ruins already explored or visited are wholly in the northern half of Yucatan, or far away from this region at the south beyond the Great Wilderness, or in the southern edge of it. Utsmal, Mayapan, Chichen Itza, and many others are in Yucatan. Palenque, Copan, and others are in the southern part of the wilderness, in Chiapas, Honduras, and Guatemala. Mr. Squire visited ruins much further south in San Salvador and in the western parts of Nicaragua and Costa Rica. The vast forest which is spread over the northern half of Guatemala and the southern half of Yucatan and extended into other states covers an area considerably larger in extent than Ohio or Pennsylvania. Does its position relative to the known ruins afford no suggestion concerning the ancient history of this forest-covered region? It is manifest that in remote ages when the older of the cities now in ruins were built, this region was a populous and important part of the country. And this is shown also by the antiquities found wherever it has been penetrated by explorers who knew how to make discoveries, as well as by the old books and traditions. Therefore, it is not unreasonable to assume that Copan and Palenque are specimens of great ruins that lie buried in it. The ruins of which something is known have merely been visited and described in part by explorers, some of whom brought away drawings of the principal objects. In giving a brief account of the more important ruins, I will begin with the old city, of which most has been heard. Palenque. No one can tell the true name of the ancient city now called Palenque. It is known to us by the name because the ruins are situated a few miles distant from the town of Palenque, now a village, but formerly a place of some importance. The ruins are in the northern part of the Mexican state of Chiapas, hidden out of sight in the forest where they seem to have been forgotten long before the time of Cortes. More than 200 years passed after the arrival of the Spaniards before their existence became known to Europeans. They were discovered about the year 1750. Since that year, decay has made some progress in them. Captain Del Rio, who visited and described them in 1787, examined 14 edifices, admirably built of hewn stone, and estimated the extent of the ruins to be 7 or 8 leagues one way along the river Chicamas, and half a league the other. He mentions a subterranean aqueduct of great solidity and durability which passes under the largest building. Other explorers have since visited Palenque and reported on the ruins by pen and pencil, but it is not certain that all the ruined edifices belonging to them have been seen, nor that the explorations have made it possible to determine the ancient extent of the city with any approach to accuracy. The very great difficulties which obstruct all attempts at complete exploration have not allowed any explorer to say he has examined or discovered all the moldering monuments hidden in the dense and tangled forest, even within the space allowed by Del Rio's half-league from the river, not to speak of what may lie buried and unknown in the dense mass of trees and undergrowth beyond this limit. The largest known building at Palenque is called the Palace. It stands near the river on a terraced pyramidal foundation 40 feet high and 310 feet long by 260 broad at the base. The edifice itself is 228 feet long, 180 wide, and 25 feet high. It faces the east and has 14 doorways on each side, with 11 at the ends. It was built entirely of hewn stone, laid with admirable precision and mortar, which seems to have been of the best quality. A corridor 9 feet wide and roofed by a pointed arch went round the building on the outside, and this was separated from another within of equal width. The palace has 4 interior courts, the largest being 70 by 80 feet in extent. These are surrounded by corridors, and the architectural work facing them is richly decorated. Within the building were many rooms. From the north side of one of the smaller courts rises a high tower or pagoda-like structure 30 feet square at the base, which goes up far above the highest elevation of the building and seems to have been still higher when the whole structure was in perfect condition. The great rectangular mound used for the foundation was cased with hewn stone, the workmanship here and everywhere else throughout the structure being very superior. The piers around the courts are covered with figures in stucco or plaster, which, where broken, reveals 6 or more coats or layers, each revealing traces of painting. This indicates that the building had been used so long before it was deserted that the plastering needed to be many times renewed. There is some evidence that painting was used as a means of decoration, but that which most engages attention is the artistic management of the stonework, and above all, the beautifully executed sculptures for ornamentation. 2 other buildings at Palenque, marked by Mr. Steffens in his plan of the ruins as Casa No. 1 and Casa No. 2, views of which are shown in figures 27 and 28, are smaller, but in some respects still more remarkable. The first of these, 75 feet long by 25 wide, stands on the summit of a high truncated pyramid and has solid walls on all sides, save the north, where there are 5 doorways. Within are a corridor and 3 rooms. Between the doorways leading from the corridor to these rooms are great tablets, each 13 feet long and 8 feet high, and all covered with elegantly carved inscriptions. A similar but smaller tablet, covered with an inscription, appears on the wall of the central room. Casa No. 2 consists of a steep and lofty truncated pyramid, which stands on a terraced foundation and has its level summit crowned with a building 50 feet long by 31 wide, which has 3 doorways at the south and within a corridor and 3 rooms. This edifice, sometimes called La Cruz, has above the height required for the rooms what is described as 2 stories of interlaced stucco work resembling a high fanciful lattice. Here, too, inscribed tablets appear on the walls, but the inscriptions, which are abundant at Palenque, are by no means confined to tablets. As the ornamentation, the walls, piers, and cornices are covered with it. Everywhere the masterly workmanship and artistic skill of the old constructors compel admiration. Mr. Steffens, going so far as to say of sculptured human figures found in fragments, in justness of proportion and symmetry, they must have approached the Greek models. Casa No. 2 of Mr. Steffens is usually called La Cruz because the most prominent object within the building is a great bas-relief on which are sculptured a cross and several human figures. This building stands on the high pyramid and is approached by a flight of steps. Dupuy says, "It is impossible to describe adequately the interior decorations of this sumptuous temple. The cross is supposed to have been the central object of interest. It was wonderfully sculptured and decorated. Human figures stand near it, and some grave ceremony seems to be represented. The infant held towards the cross by one of the figures suggests a christening ceremony. The cross is one of the most common emblems present in all the ruins. This led the Catholic missionaries to assume that knowledge of Christianity had been brought to that part of America long before their arrival, and they adopted the belief that the gospel was preached there by St. Thomas. This furnished excellent material for the hagiologists of that age, but like everything else peculiar to these monkish romancers, it betrayed great lack of knowledge. The cross, even the so-called Latin cross, is not exclusively a Christian emblem. It was used in the Oriental world many centuries, perhaps millennium, before the Christian era. It was a religious emblem of the Phoenicians, associated with Astarte, who is usually figured bearing what is called a Latin cross. She is seen so figured on Phoenician coins. The cross is found in the ruins of Nineveh. Mr. Layard, describing one of the first specimens of Assyrian sculpture, the figure of an early Nimrod king he calls it, says, "Round his neck, are hung the four sacred signs: the crescent, the star or sun, the trident, and the cross. These signs, the cross included, appear suspended from the necks or collars of Oriental prisoners figured on Egyptian monuments known to be 1,500 years older than the Christian era. The cross was a common emblem in ancient Egypt, and the Latin form of it was used in the religious mysteries of that country in connection with a monogram of the moon. It was to degrade this religious emblem of the Phoenicians that Alexander ordered the execution of 2,000 principal citizens of Tyre by crucifixion. The cross, as an emblem, is very common among the antiquities of Western Europe, where archaeological investigation has sometimes been embarrassed and confused by the assumption that any old monument bearing the figure of a cross cannot be as old as Christianity. What more will be found at Palenque when the whole field of its ruins has been explored cannot now be reported. The chief difficulty by which explorers are embarrassed is manifest in this statement of Mr. Steffens. Without a guide, we might have gone within 100 feet of the building without discovering one of them. More has been discovered there than I have mentioned, my purpose being to give an accurate view of the style, finish, decoration, and general character of the architecture and artistic work found in the ruins, rather than a complete account of everything connected with them. The ruins at Palenque are deemed important by archaeologists partly on account of the great abundance of inscriptions found there, which, it is believed, will at length be deciphered, the written characters being similar to those of the Mayas, which are now understood. Copan and Kirigwa. The ruins known as Copan are situated in the extreme western part of Honduras, where they are densely covered by the forest. As already stated, they were first discovered by Europeans about 40 years after the War of Conquest swept through that part of the country, and were at the time wholly mysterious to the natives. The monuments seem older than those at Palenque, but we have only scant descriptions of them. They are situated in a wild and solitary part of the country where the natives see as little of strangers as the Arabs about Mount Sinai and are more suspicious. For this reason, they have not been very carefully explored. It is known that these ruins extend 2 or 3 miles along the left bank of the river Copan. Not much has been done to discover how far they extend from the river into the forest. Mr. Steffens describes as follows his first view of them. We came to the right bank of the river and saw directly opposite a stone wall from 60 to 90 feet high, with firs growing out of the top, running north and south along the river 624 feet, in some places fallen and others entire. This great wall supported the rear side of the elevated foundation of a great edifice. It was made of cut stone, well laid in mortar or cement, the blocks of stone being 6 feet long. Figure 29 shows the wall somewhat imperfectly. He saw next a square stone column standing by itself, 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side. From top to bottom, it was richly ornamented with sculptured design on 2 opposite sides, the other sides being covered with inscriptions finely carved on the stone. On the front face, surrounded by the sculptured ornaments, was the figure of a man. 14 other obelisks of the same kind were seen, some being higher than this. Some of them had fallen. These sculptured and inscribed pillars constitute the chief peculiarity of Copan. Mr. Squire says of them, "The ruins of Copan and the corresponding monuments which I examined in the valley of the Chimilican are distinguished by singular and elaborately carved monoliths, which seem to have been replaced at Palenque by equally elaborate basso-relievos belonging, it would seem, to a later and more advanced period of art." The great building first noticed stands or stood on a pyramidal foundation which is supported along the river by that high-backed wall. The structure extends 624 feet on the river line. Mr. Steffens describes it as an oblong enclosure and states it has a wide terrace nearly 100 feet above the river on which great trees are growing, some of them more than 20 feet in circumference. Here, as at Palenque, the ornamentation was rich and abundant. The ruins, greatly worn by decay, still show that architecture, sculpture, painting, and all the arts that embellish life had flourished in this overgrown forest. Some beautifully executed sculptures were found buried in the earth, and there can be no doubt that extensive excavation, if it were possible in that almost invincible forest, would lead to important and valuable discoveries. Besides the great building and the monoliths, several pyramidal structures are mentioned by Mr. Steffens, who points out that extensive exploration is impossible unless one shall first clear away the forest and burn up the trees. Palacios, who described this ruined city nearly 300 years ago, saw much more than Mr. Steffens. He described the ruins of superb edifices, built of hewn stone, which manifestly belonged to a large city. He mentions in connection with the Great Wall an enormous eagle carved in stone, which bore a square shield on its breast covered with undecipherable characters. He mentions also a stone giant and a stone cross with one arm broken. He saw a plaza, circular in form, surrounded by ranges of steps or seats, which reminded him of the Colosseum at Rome, as many as 80 ranges still remaining in some places. This plaza was paved with beautiful stones, all square and well worked. 6 of the great obelisks, which he described as statues, stood in this enclosure, and its center was a great stone basin. A history of Guatemala by a writer named Hauros states that the Circus of Copan, as he calls the plaza, described by Palacios, was still entire in the year 1700. He mentions gateways which led into the enclosure and says it was surrounded on the outside by stone pyramids 6 yards high, near which were standing sculptured figures or obelisks. No doubt remains of this remarkable circus would be found now if the forest should be removed. What else could be found there by means of careful and thorough exploration may never be known, for this region is uninviting, the forest very difficult, and such an exploration would require much more than the means and efforts of 1 or 2 individuals. Not very far away, in the neighboring state of Guatemala on the right bank of the river Montagua, to which the Copan is a tributary, are the ruins called Kirigwa. It is manifest that a great city once stood here. These ruins have a close resemblance to those at Copan, but they appear to be much older, for they have, to a great extent, become little more than heaps of rubbish. Over a large space of ground, traces of what has gone to decay are visible. Doubtless important relics of the old city are now more abundant below the surface than above it. Mr. Steffens, describing what he saw there, confines his attention chiefly to the pyramidal structure with flights of steps and monoliths larger and higher than those at Copan, but otherwise similar. He states, however, that while they have the same general style, the sculptures are in lower relief and hardly so rich in design. One of the obelisks here is 20 feet high, 5 feet 6 inches wide, and 2 feet 8 inches thick. The chief figures carved on it are that of a man on the front and that of a woman on the back. The sides are covered with inscriptions similar in appearance to those at Copan. Some of the other standing obelisks are higher than this. It seems reasonable to infer that the structures at Kirigwa were more ancient than those at Copan. Mitla. The ruins called Mitla are in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, about 12 leagues east from the city of Oaxaca. They are situated in the upper part of a great valley and surrounded by a waste, uncultivated region. At the time of the Spanish conquest, they were old and much worn by the elements, but a very large area was then covered by remains of ancient buildings. At present, only 6 decaying edifices and 3 ruined pyramids, which were very finely terraced, remain for examination. The other structures being now reduced to the last stage. These structures, as given by von Temsky, figures 32 from Charnay's photograph, show a ruin at Mitla. These important ruins were not described by Stephens and Catherwood. Captain Dupay's work gives some account of them, and Desiree Charnay, who saw them since 1860, brought away photographs of some of the monuments. 4 of the standing edifices are described by Dupay as palaces, and these, he says, were erected with lavish magnificence. They combine the solidity of the works of Egypt with the elegance of those of Greece, and he adds, "But what is most remarkable, interesting, and striking in these monuments, and which alone would be sufficient to give them the first rank among all known orders of architecture, is the execution of their mosaic relievos, very different from plain mosaic and consequently requiring more ingenious combination and greater art and labor. They are inlaid on the surface of the wall, and their duration is owing to the method of fixing the prepared stones into the stone surface, which made their union with it perfect." Figure 33, taken from Charnay's photograph, shows part of the mosaic decoration on the wall of one of the great edifices at Mitla. The general character of the architecture and masonry is much like that seen in the structures at Palenque, but the finish of the workmanship appears to have been more artistic and admirable. These ruins are remarkable among those of the country where they are found. All those who have seen them speak much as Dupay speaks of the perfection of the masonry, the admirable design and finish of the work, and the beauty of the decorations. Their beauty, says Mr. Charnay, can be matched only by the monuments of Greece and Rome in their best days. One fact presented by some of the edifices at Mitla has a certain degree of historical significance. There appears to be evidence that they were occupied at some period by people less advanced in civilization than their builders. Mr. Charnay, describing one of them, points out this fact. He says of the structure, "It is a bewildering maze of courts and buildings, with facings ornamented with mosaics in relief of the purest design. But under the projections are found traces of paintings wholly primitive in style, in which the right line is not even respected. These are rude figures of idols and meandering lines that have no significance. Similar paintings appear with the same imperfection on every great edifice in places which have allowed them shelter against the ravages of time. These rude designs associated with palaces, so correct in architecture and so ornamented with panels of mosaic of such marvelous workmanship, put strange thoughts in the mind. To find the explanation of this phenomenon, must we not suppose these palaces were occupied by a race less advanced in civilization than their first builders? 2 miles or more away from the great edifices here mentioned, towards the west, is the Castle of Mitla. It was built on the summit of an isolated and precipitous hill of rock, which is accessible only on the east side. The whole level summit of this hill is enclosed by a solid wall of hewn stone 21 feet thick and 18 feet high. This wall has salient and retiring angles with curtains interposed. On the east side, it is flanked by double walls. Within the enclosure are the remains of several small buildings. The field of these ruins was very large 300 years ago. At the time, it may have included this castle. An astronomical monument. In this part of Mexico, Captain Dupay examined a peculiar ruin, of which he gave the following account. Near the road from the village of Tlaumanalco to that called Mayapan, about 3 miles east of the latter, there is an isolated granite rock which was artificially formed into a kind of pyramid with 6 hewn steps facing the east. The summit of this structure is a platform or horizontal plane, well adapted to observation of the stars on every side of the hemisphere. It is almost demonstrable that this very ancient monument was exclusively devoted to astronomical observations, for on the south side of the rock are sculptured several hieroglyphical figures having relation to astronomy. The most striking figure in the group is that of a man in profile, standing erect and directing his view to the rising stars in the sky. He holds to his eye a tube or optical instrument. Below his feet is a frieze divided into 6 compartments with as many celestial signs carved on its surface. It has been already stated that finely wrought telescopic tubes have been found among remains of the mound builders. They were used, it seems, by the ancient people of Mexico and Central America, and they were known also in ancient Peru, where a silver figure of a man in the act of using such a tube has been discovered in one of the old tombs. Ruins farther south. Old ruins, of which but little is known, exist in Guatemala, Honduras, San Salvador, and the more southern portion of Central America. Mr. Squire, who tells us more of them than any other explorer, says, "I heard of remains and monuments in Honduras and San Salvador equal to those of Copan in extent and interest." He mentions the ruins of Opico near San Vicente in San Salvador, which cover nearly 2 square miles and consist of vast terraces, ruins of edifices, circular and square towers, and subterranean galleries, all built of cut stones. A single carving has been found here on a block of stone. Remains of immense works exist in the district of Chontales, near the northern shore of Lake Nicaragua, and pottery found in Nicaragua equals the best specimens of Mexico and Peru. Don Jose Antonio Urrutia, cure of Jutiapa, gave the following account of a great ruin on a mountain in San Salvador near the town of Comapa. It is called Sinaca Macalo. The walls or remains of the city wall describe an oval figure, within which roads or streets may be traced, and there are various subterranean passages and many ruined edifices. The materials of construction are chiefly thin stones or a species of slate united by a kind of cement which in appearance resembles melted lead. It does not appear that he made a complete examination of the monuments, but he mentions 3 that gained his attention and left upon his mind a very strong impression. The first is a temple consecrated to the sun, chiefly excavated in the solid rock and having its entrance towards the east. On the archway of the entrance are carved representations of the sun and moon. Hieroglyphics are found in the interior. Beside the sculptured bassi-relievi, these stones bear hieroglyphics painted with a kind of red varnish which remains unimpaired. The second is a great stone slab covered with inscriptions or hieroglyphics. The third is the figure of a wild animal sculptured on a rock or stone of great size. The ruins in Yucatan. The remains of ancient cities are abundant in the settled portion of Yucatan, which lies north of the Great Forest. Charnay found the country covered with them from north to south. Stephan states in the preface to his work on Yucatan that he visited 44 ruined cities or places in which such remains are still found, most of which were unknown to white men, even to those inhabiting the country, and he adds that time and the elements are hastening them to utter destruction. Previous to the Spanish conquest, the region known to us as Yucatan was called Maya. It is still called Maya by the natives among themselves, and this is the true name of the country. Why the Spanish called it Yucatan is unknown, but the name of it wholly arbitrary and without reason. It is said to have arisen from an odd mistake like that which occasioned the name given to one of the capes by Hernandez de Cordova. Being on the coast in 1517, he met some of the natives. Their cacique said to him, "Conex Cotoch," meaning, "Come to our town." The Spaniard, supposing he had mentioned the name of the place, immediately named the projecting point of land Cape Catoche, and it is called so still. At that time, the country was occupied by the people still known as Mayas. They all spoke the same language, which was one of a closely related family of tongues spoken in Guatemala, Chiapas, western Honduras, and in some other districts of Central America and Mexico. Yucatan was then much more populous than at present. The people had more civilization, more regular industry, and more wealth. They were much more highly skilled in the arts of civilized life. They had cities and large towns and dwelling houses built of timber and covered with thatch, like those common in England, were scattered all over the rural districts. Some of the cities now found in ruins were then inhabited. This peninsula had been the seat of an important feudal monarchy which arose probably after the Toltecs overthrew the very ancient kingdom of Xibalba. It was broken up by a rebellion of the feudal lords about 100 years previous to the arrival of the Spaniards. According to the Maya chronicles, its downfall occurred in the year 1420. Mayapan, the capital of this kingdom, was destroyed at the time and never afterwards inhabited. Merida, the present capital of Yucatan, was built on the site of an ancient Maya city called Tihu. It is stated in the old Spanish accounts of Merida that it was built on that site because there was in the ruins an abundance of building material. There is mention of 2 mounds which furnished a vast amount of hewn stone. Mr. Steffens noticed in some of the edifices stones with sculptured figures from the ruins of ancient buildings, and he mentions that a portion of ancient building, including an arch in the Maya style, was retained in the construction of the Franciscan convent. Mayapan. We shall notice only some of the principal ruins in Yucatan, beginning with Mayapan, the ancient capital. The remains of this city are situated about 10 leagues in a southern direction from Merida. They are spread over an extensive plain and overgrown by trees and other vegetation. The most prominent object seen by the approaching explorer is a great mound 60 feet high and 100 feet square at the base. It is an imposing structure seen through the trees and is itself overgrown like a wooden hill. Figure 34 shows one view of this. 4 stairways in a ruinous condition, 25 feet wide, lead up to an esplanade within 6 feet of the top, which is reached by a smaller stairway. The summit is a plain stone platform 15 feet square. This, of course, was a temple. Sculptured stones are scattered around the base, and within the mound subterranean chambers have been discovered. It is probable that the principal edifices at Mayapan were not all built wholly of stone, for they have mostly disappeared. Only one remains, a circular stone building 25 feet in diameter, which stands on a pyramidal foundation 35 feet high. This is represented in figure 35. On the southwest side of it, on a terrace projecting from the mound, was a double row of columns without capitals 8 feet apart. There are indications that this city was old and that the buildings had been more than once removed. Brasseur de Bourbourg classes some of the foundations at Mayapan with the oldest, seen at Palenque and Copan. This point, however, cannot be determined with sufficient accuracy to remove all doubt. Mayapan may have stood upon the foundations of a very ancient city, which was several times rebuilt, but the city destroyed in 1420 could not have been as old as either Palenque or Copan. Utsmal. The ruins of Utsmal have been regarded as the most important in Yucatan, partly on account of the edifices that remain standing, but chiefly because they have been more visited and explored than the others. It is supposed, and circumstantial evidence appears to warrant the supposition, that this city had not been wholly deserted at the time of the Spanish conquest, although it had previously begun to be a ruin. It was wholly a ruin in 1673. The area covered by its remains is extensive. Charnay makes it a league or more in diameter, but most of the structures have fallen and exist now only in fragments scattered over the ground. It may be that many of them were not built wholly of hewn stone and had not Egyptian solidity with their other characteristics. The most important of those remaining was named Casa del Gobernador by the Spaniards. It is 320 feet long and was built of hewn stone laid in mortar or cement. The faces of the walls are smooth up to the cornice. Then follows on all the 4 sides one solid mass of rich, complicated, and elaborately sculptured ornaments forming a sort of arabesque. Figure 36 gives a view of the south end of this edifice, but no engraving can show all the details of the ornamentation. This building has 11 doorways in the front and one at each end, all having wooden lintels, which have fallen. The two principal rooms are 60 feet long and from 11 to 13 feet wide. This structure is long and narrow. It stands on the summit of one of the grandest of the terraced foundations. This foundation, like all the others, is pyramidal. It has 3 terraces. The longest is 3 feet high, 15 feet wide, and 575 long. The second is 20 feet high, 275 wide, and 545 long. The third, 19 feet high, 30 wide, and 360 long. Structures formerly existed on the second terrace, remains of which are visible. At the northwest corner, one of them still shows its dilapidated walls, portions of them being sufficiently complete to show what they were. This edifice was 94 feet long and 34 wide. It seems to have been finely finished in a style more simple than that of the great casa on the upper terrace. The figures of turtles sculptured along the upper edge of the cornice have given it the current designation House of the Turtles. Sculptured monuments have been found buried in the soil of the second terrace. The opening of a small, low mound situated on it brought to view the double-headed figure shown in number 38. Figure 39 shows part of the sculptured decoration over the center doorway of Casa del Gobernador. Another important edifice at Utsmal has been named Casa de las Monjas, House of the Nuns. It stands on a terraced foundation and is arranged around a quadrangular courtyard, 258 feet one way and 214 the other. The front structure is 279 feet long and has a gateway at the center 10 feet 8 inches wide, leading into the court and 4 doors on each side of it. The outer face of the wall above the cornice is ornamented with sculptures. The terrace, without and within the enclosure, was found covered with a very dense growth of vegetation, which it was necessary to clear away before the walls could be carefully examined. All the doorways, save those in front, open on the court. Mr. Steffens found the 4 great facades fronting the courtyard ornamented from one end to the other with the richest and most intricate carving known to the builders of Utsmal, presenting a scene of strange magnificence which surpasses any other now seen among its ruins. The long outer structure of the side facing the entrance had high turret-like elevations over each of its 13 doorways, all covered with sculptured ornaments. This building appears to have enclosed another of older date. Figure 40 shows the ground plan of Las Monjas. Other less important edifices in the ruins of Utsmal have been described by explorers, some of which stand on high pyramidal mounds, and inscriptions are found here, but they are not so abundant as at Palenque and Copan. Kaaba. The ruins known as Kaaba are on the site of what must have been one of the most imposing and important of the more ancient sites. Here the most conspicuous object is a stone-faced mound 180 feet square at the base, with a range of ruined apartments at the bottom. 300 or 400 yards from this mound is a terraced foundation 20 feet high and 200 by 142 in extent, on which stands the remains of a great edifice. At the right of this esplanade before it is a high range of ruined structures overgrown with trees, and an immense back wall on the outer line of the esplanade perpendicular to the bottom of the terrace. On the left is another range of ruined buildings, and in the center a stone enclosure 27 feet square and 7 feet high, with sculptures and inscriptions around the base. Some of the ornamentation of this building has been described in the strongest terms of admiration. Mr. Steffens said of it, "The cornice running over the doorways, tried by the severest rules of art recognized among us, would embellish the architecture of any known era. At Utsmal, the walls were smooth below the cornice. Here, they are covered with decorations from top to bottom." This field of ruins is extensive, and only a portion of it has been examined. It is so overgrown that exploration is very difficult. The buildings and mounds are much decayed, and they seem to be very old. It is believed that ruined edifices of which nothing is known are hidden among the trees in places which no explorer has approached. Mr. Steffens gave the first account of Kaaba and described 3 other important edifices besides that already named. One of these he thought was, when entire, the most imposing structure at Kaaba. It was 147 feet long by 106 wide and had 3 distinct stories, each successive story being smaller than that below it. Another standing on the upper terrace of an elevated foundation, 170 feet long by 110 broad, was 164 feet in length and comparatively narrow. It is mentioned as a peculiarity of this edifice that it had pillars in its doorways used as supports. The other, found standing on a terrace, is also long and narrow, and has a comparatively plain front. Remains of other buildings are visible, but in all cases they are so completely in ruins as to be little more than heaps of debris. Some of the ruins in the woods beyond that part of the field which is most accessible are visible from the great mound described. A resolute attempt to penetrate the forest brought the explorers in view of great edifices standing on an elevated terrace estimated to be 800 feet long by 100 feet wide. The decorations seem to have been abundant and very rich, but the structures were in a sad state of dilapidation. One remarkable monument found at Kaaba resembles a triumphal arch. It stands by itself on a ruined mound apart from other structures. It is described as a lonely arch, having a span of 14 feet, rising on the field of ruins in solitary grandeur. Figure 41 gives a view of it. Kaaba was an ancient city. The ruins are old, and the city may have belonged to the first age of the Maya period. Chichen Itza. The ruins of Chichen Itza are situated east of the Mayapan, about halfway between the eastern and western coasts of the peninsula of Yucatan. A public road runs through the space of ground over which they are spread. The area covered by them is something less than a mile in diameter. The general character of the ruined structures found here is in every respect like that shown by ruins already described. One of the great buildings at this place has a rude, unornamental exterior and does not stand on an artificial terrace, although the ground before it was excavated so as to give the appearance of an elevated foundation. It is 149 feet long by 48 deep. Its special peculiarity consists of a stone lintel in a very dark inner room, which has an inscription and a sculptured figure on the underside. The writing closely resembles that seen at Palenque and Copan. Was this sculptured stone made originally for the place it now occupies, or was it taken from the ruins of some older city which flourished and went to decay before Chichen Itza was built? Another structure seen here closely resembles Las Moñas at Utsmal, and bears the same name, but it differs somewhat from the Utsmal Moñas in arrangement. In the descriptions, special mention is made of the richness and beauty of its ornaments. A noticeable edifice connected with the Moñas, called the Church, is 26 feet long, 14 deep, 31 high, and has 3 cornices, the spaces between them being covered with carved ornaments. There is but one room in it. One of the most picturesque ruins at Chichen Itza is circular in form and stands on the upper level of a double-terraced platform. It is 22 feet in diameter and has 4 doors, which face the cardinal points. Above the cornice, it slopes gradually almost to a point, and the top is about 60 feet above the ground. The grand staircase of 20 steps leading up to this building is 45 feet wide and has a sort of balustrade formed of the entwined bodies of huge serpents. At some distance from this is the ruined structure known as the Casa Colorado, or Red House. This is shown in figure 42. It is 43 feet long by 23 deep and stands on a platform 62 feet long by 55 wide. It was ornamented above the cornice, but the decorations are much defaced by decay. A stone tablet extending the whole length of the back wall inside is covered by an inscription. A remarkable structure is found at this place, which Mr. Stephens calls the gymnasium or tennis court. It consists of two immense parallel walls, 274 feet long, 30 thick, and 120 apart. On elevations facing the two ends of the open space between them, 100 feet from the ends of the walls, stand two edifices much ruined but showing in their remains that they were richly ornamented. Midway in the length of the walls facing each other and 20 feet above the ground are two massive stone rings or circles 4 feet in diameter, each having in the center a hole 1 foot and 7 inches in diameter. On the borders around these holes, two entwined serpents are sculptured as seen in figure 43. There was a similar structure in the old city of Mexico, and remains of one like it are found at Mayapan. They were probably used for games of some kind. Among the other ruins at Chichen Itza are the remains of a lofty edifice which has two high ranges or stories. On the outside, the ornamentation is simple and tasteful, but the walls of its chambers are very elaborately decorated, mostly with sculptured designs which seem to have been painted. In one of the upper rooms, Mr. Stephens found a beam of sapote wood used as a lintel, which was covered with very elegantly carved decorations. The walls of this room were covered from the bottom to the top of the arched ceiling with painted designs similar to those seen in the Mexican picture writing. Decay had mutilated these pictures, but the colors were still bright. There are indications that paintings were generally used by the Aboriginal builders even on their sculptures. The colors seen in this room were green, red, yellow, blue, and reddish-brown. Another edifice standing on a high mound is reached by means of the usual great stairway, which begins at the bottom with a sort of balustrade on each side, the ends of which are stone figures of heads of immense serpents. Not far from this is a singular ruin consisting of groups of small columns standing in rows 5 abreast, the tallest being not more than 6 feet high. Many of them have fallen. It is impossible to determine how they were used or what they mean. Other ruins in Yucatan. Utsmal, Labna, Zayi, and some of the other ruins are sufficiently important for special notice, but they present everywhere the same characteristics, differing a little in the style or method of ornamentation. At Labna, there is among the ruins an ancient gateway, beautiful in design and construction, a view of which is given in the frontispiece. The best account of some of the other ruins on the peninsula can be found in the volumes of Mr. Stephens entitled Incidents of Travel in Yucatan. At Zayi, there is a singular building which, as seen at a distance by Mr. Stephens, had the appearance of a New England factory. But what seems to be a factory is in fact nothing more than a massive wall with oblong openings which runs along the middle of the roof and rises 30 feet above it. The building was below this wall, but the front part of it had fallen. Among the remains at Tskoch is the great mound represented in figure 44. There is a remarkable ruin at Ake at the south, which deserves mention. Here on the summit of a great mound, very level and 225 feet by 50 in extent, stand 36 shafts or columns in 3 parallel rows. The columns are about 15 feet high and 4 feet square. The ruins of Ake, which cover a great space, are ruder and more massive than most of the others. The island of Cozumel and the adjacent coast of Yucatan were populous when the Spaniards first went there, but the great towns then inhabited are now in ruins. Water is scarce on this peninsula, and a sufficient supply is not obtained without considerable difficulty. The ancient inhabitants provided for this lack of water by constructing agudas, or artificial ponds. These, or many of them, doubtless, are as old as the oldest of the ruined cities. Intelligence, much skill in masonry, and much labor were required to construct them. They were paved with several courses of stone laid in cement, and their bottoms wells or cavities were constructed. More than 40 such wells were found in the bottom of one of those agudas at Galal, which has been repaired and restored to use. A section of the bottom of this aguda is shown in Figure 45. In some places, long subterranean passages lead down to pools of water which are used in the dry season. One of these subterranean reservoirs and the cavernous passage leading to it are shown in Figure 46. The reservoir is 450 feet below the surface of the ground, and the passage leading to it is about 1,400 feet long. Branching passages, not shown, lead to 2 or 3 other basins of water. The wooden lintels, which are common in Yucatan, do not appear in the other ruins, and there is a difference in style of ornamentation between those at Palenque or Copan, for instance, and those at Utsmal. But everywhere, the architecture is regulated by the same idea, the differences indicating nothing more than different periods and different phases of development in the history of the same people. Some of the great edifices in the old ruins, such as the palace at Palenque and the Casa del Gobernador at Utsmal, reminds us of the communal buildings of the pueblos, and yet there is a wide difference between them. They are not unlike either in character or purpose, although such great buildings as the palace may have been designed for the occupation of several families. There is no indication that communal residences were ever common in this part of the country. At the time of the conquest, the houses of the people were ordinary family dwellings made of wood, and we may reasonably suppose this fashion of building was handed down from the earlier ages. Herrera, who supposed, mistakenly, that all the great stone edifices were temples, said in his account of Yucatan, "There were so many and such stately stone buildings that it was amazing. And the greatest wonder was that, having no use of any metal, they were able to raise such structures, which seemed to have been temples, for their houses were all of timber and thatched. But they had the use of metals, and they had the art of making some of them admirable for the use in cutting stone and carving wood." Among the buildings of later date are some of those on the western coast, which were still inhabited 350 years ago. The city of Tulum was inhabited then. Figure 47 shows a ground plan of the walls of the city with the position of some of the ruined monuments. Within the walls are remains of finely constructed buildings on elevated foundations. None of them, however, very large. One of them had a wooden roof, and timber seems to have been considerably used here. The walls still standing were made of hewn stone. Remains of stone edifices exist all along this coast, but the whole region is now covered by a dense growth of trees and other vegetation. Tulum was seen in 1518 by Grijalva, who sailed along the coast. At that time, the island of Cozumel, where noteworthy ruins are found, was inhabited by many people. Figure 48 shows one of the watchtowers on the walls of Tulum. 6. Antiquity of the ruins. The Mexican and Central American ruins make it certain that, in ancient times, an important civilization existed in that part of the continent, which must have begun at a remote period in the past. If they had any significance, this must be accepted as an ascertained fact. A large proportion of them had been forgotten in the forests or become mythical and mysterious long before the arrival of the Spaniards. In 1520, 350 years ago, the forest, which so largely covers Yucatan, Guatemala, and Chiapas, was growing as it grows now. Yes, 450 years ago, for it was there a century previous to this date when the Maya kingdom, being broken up, one of its princes fled into the forest with a portion of his people, the Itzas, and settled at Lake Piten. It was the same then as now. How many additional centuries it had existed, no one can tell. If its age could be told, it would still be necessary to consider that the ruins hidden in it are much older than the forest, and that the period of civilization they represent closed long before it was established. In the ages previous to the beginning of this immense forest, the region it covers was the seat of a civilization which grew up to a high degree of development, flourished a long time, and finally declined, until its cities were deserted and its cultivated fields left to the wild influences of nature. It may be safely assumed that both the forest-covered ruins and the forest itself are far older than the Aztec period, but who can tell how much older? Copan, first discovered and described 300 years ago, was then as strange to the natives dwelling near it as the old Chaldean ruins are to the Arabs who wander over the wasted plains of lower Mesopotamia. Native tradition had forgotten its history and become silent in regard to it. How long had ruined Copan been in this condition? No one can tell. Manifestly, it was forgotten, left buried in the forest without recollection of its history, long before Montezuma's people, the Aztecs, rose to power, and it is easily understood that this old city had an important history previous to that unknown time in the past when war, revolution, or some other agency of destruction put an end to its career and left it to become what it is now. Moreover, these old ruins, in all cases, show us only the cities last occupied in the periods to which they belong. Doubtless others, still older, preceded them, and besides, it can be seen that some of these ruined cities which now can be traced were several times renewed by reconstructions. We must consider also that building magnificent cities is not the first work of an original civilization. The development was necessarily gradual. Its first period was more or less rude. The art of building and ornamenting such edifices arose slowly. Many ages must have been required to develop such admirable skill in masonry and ornamentation. Therefore, the period between the beginning of this mysterious development of civilized life and the first builders who used cut stone laid in mortar and cement and covered their work with beautifully sculptured ornaments and inscriptions must have been very long. We have no measure of time, no clue to the old dates, noting whatever beyond such considerations as I have stated, to warrant even a vague hypothesis. It can be seen clearly that the beginning of this old civilization was much older than the earliest great cities, and also that these were much more ancient than the time when any of the later built or reconstructed cities whose relics still exist were left to decay. If we suppose Palenque to have been deserted some 600 years previous to the Spanish conquest, this date will carry us back only to the last days of its history as an inhabited city. Beyond it, in the distant past, it is a vast period in which the civilization represented by Palenque was developed, made capable of building such cities, and then carried on through the many ages during which cities became numerous, flourished, grew old, and gave place to others until the long history of Palenque itself began. Those who have sought to discredit what is told of the Aztec civilization and the empire of Montezuma have never failed to admit fully the significance of Copan, Palenque, and Mitla. One or two writers bearing the assumption that the barbarous tribes at the north and the old Mexicans were of the same race and substantially the same people have undertaken to give us the history of Montezuma's empire entirely rewritten and show that his people were Mexican savages. In their hands, Montezuma is transformed into a barbarous Indian chief, and the city of Mexico becomes a rude Indian village, situated among the islands and lagoons of an Everglade which afforded unusual facilities for fishing and snaring birds. One goes so far as to maintain this with considerable vehemence and amusing unconsciousness of absurdity. He is sure that Montezuma was nothing more than the principal chief of a parcel of wild Indian tribes, and that the Pueblos are wild Indians changed to their present condition by Spanish influence. There is something in this akin to lunacy. But this topic will receive more attention in another place. I bring it to view here because those who maintain so strangely that the Aztecs were Indian savages admit all this is claimed for the wonderful ruins at the south and give them a very great antiquity. They maintain, however, that the civilization represented by these ruins was brought to this continent in remote prehistoric times by the people known as Phoenicians, and their method of finding the Phoenicians at Palenque, Copan, and everywhere else is similar in character and value to that by which they transformed the Aztec Empire into a rude confederacy of wild Indians. Distinct eras traced. It is a point of no little interest that these old constructions belong to different periods in the past and represent somewhat different phases of civilization. Utsmal, which is supposed to have been partly inhabited when the Spaniards arrived in the country, is plainly much more modern than Copan or Palenque. This is easily traced in the ruins. Its edifices were finished in a different style and show fewer inscriptions. Round pillars somewhat in the Doric style are found at Utsmal, but none like the square, richly carved pillars bearing inscriptions discovered in some of the other ruins. Copan and Palenque and even Kaaba in Yucatan may have been very old cities, if not already old ruins when Utsmal was built. Accepting the reports of explorers as correct, there is evidence in the ruins that Kirigwa is older than Copan and that Copan is older than Palenque. The old monuments in Yucatan represent several distinct epochs in the ancient history of that peninsula. Some of them are kindred to those hidden in the Great Forest and remind us more of Palenque than of Utsmal. Among those described, the most modern or most of these are in Yucatan. They belong to the time when the kingdom of the Mayas flourished. Many of the others belong to ages previous to the rise of this kingdom, and in ages still earlier, ages older than the Great Forest. There were other cities, doubtless, whose remains have perished utterly or were long ago removed for use in the later constructions. The evidence of repeated reconstructions in some of the cities before they were deserted has been pointed out by explorers. I have quoted what Charnay says of it in his description of Mitla. At Palenque, as at Mitla, the oldest work is the most artistic and admirable. Over this feature of the monuments and the manifest signs of their difference in age, the attention of investigators has lingered in speculation. They find in them a significance which is stated as follows by Brasseur de Bourbourg. Among the edifices forgotten by time in the forests of Mexico and Central America, we find architectural characteristics so different from each other that it is impossible to attribute them to all the same people as to believe they were all built at the same epoch. In his view, the substructions at Mayapan, some of those at Tula, and a great part of those at Palenque are among the older remains. These are not the oldest cities whose remains are still visible, but they may have been built in part upon the foundations of cities much more ancient. Nothing perishable left. No well-considered theory of these ruins can avoid the conclusion that most of them are very ancient, and that, to find the origin of the civilization they represent, we must go far back into the deeps of antiquity. On all the fields of desolation where they exist, everything perishable has disappeared. Wooden lintels are mentioned, but these can hardly be regarded as constituting an exception when the character of the wood and the circumstances that contributed to their preservation are considered. Moreover, Wooden lintels seem to have been peculiar to Yucatan, where many of the great edifices were constructed in the later times, and some of them of perishable materials. Everywhere in the older ruins, nothing remains but the artificial mounds and foundations of earth, the stone, the cement, the stucco, hard as marble, and other imperishable materials used by the builders. If the edifices had all been made of wood, there would now be nothing to show us that the older cities had ever existed. Every trace of them would have been obliterated long before our time, and most of them would have disappeared entirely long before the country was seen by the Spaniards. The places where they stood, with no relics save the mounds and pyramidal platforms, would resemble the works of our mound builders, and not a few sound historical critics would consider it in the highest degree absurd to suggest that cities with such structures have ever existed there. Under the circumstances supposed, how wisely skepticism could talk against a suggestion of this kind at Copan, Mitla, or Palenque, and how difficult it would be to find a satisfactory answer to its reasonings. Nevertheless, those mysterious structures have not wholly disappeared, and we can easily understand that there was a time when large areas connected with them were covered with buildings of a less durable character. I have referred to a writer who maintains with more vehemence than candor that the Aztecs and all the other people found in the country were savages, not greatly different from the wild Indians farther north. While he admits the significance and great antiquity of these ruins, his conception of their antiquity is somewhat extreme, for he says they must have existed for thousands of years when the Spaniards arrived. If he had maintained that civilized communities were there thousands of years previous to that time, developing the skill in architecture, decoration, and writing to which the monuments bear witness, it might be possible to agree with him. Some of us, however, would probably stipulate that he should not count too many thousands, nor claim a similar antiquity for the ruins now visible. It is not easy to suppose that any of these old monuments, with their well-preserved sculptures and inscriptions, represent the first period of the ancient history they suggest, nor that they have existed as ruins many thousands of years, for the climate of Mexico and Central America does not preserve such remains like that of Egypt. Nevertheless, some of them must be very old. The forest established since the ruin began, the entire disappearance of everything more perishable than stone, the utter oblivion which veiled their history in the time of Montezuma and probably long previous to his time, all these facts bear witness to their great antiquity. In many of them, as at Kirigwa and Kaaba, the stone structures have become masses of debris, and even at Copan, Palenque, and Mitla, only a few of them are sufficiently well preserved to show us what they were in the great days of their history. Meanwhile, keep in mind that the ruined cities did not begin their present condition until the civilization that created them had declined, and also that if we could determine exactly the date when they were deserted and left to decay, we should only reach that point in the past where their history as inhabited cities was brought to a close. Take Copan, for instance. This city may have become a ruin during the time of the Toltecs, which began long before the Christian era and ended some 5 or 6 centuries probably before the country was invaded by Cortez. It was built before their time, for the style of writing and many features of the architecture and ornamentation show the workmanship of their predecessors, judging by the historical imitations found in the old books and traditions. We may suppose it to have been an old city at the time of the Toltec invasion, although not one of the first cities built by that more ancient and more cultivated people by whom this old American civilization was originated. The present condition of the monuments at Kirigwa is still more suggestive of great age. The oldest of civilizations. Some investigators who have given much study to the antiquities, traditions, old books, and probable geographical history of Mexico and Central America believe that the first civilization the world ever saw appeared in this part of ancient America or was immediately connected with it. They hold that the human race first rose to civilized life in America, which is, geologically, the oldest of the continents, and that, ages ago, the portion of this continent on which the first civilizers appear was sunk beneath the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Usually, the engulfing of this portion of the land is supposed to have been effected by some tremendous convulsion of nature, and there is appeal to recollections of such a catastrophe, said to have been preserved in the old books of Central America and also in those of Egypt, from which Solon received an account of the lost Atlantis. According to this hypothesis, the American continent formerly extended from Mexico, Central America, and New Granada far into the Atlantic Ocean towards Europe and Africa, covering all the space now occupied by the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the West India Islands, and going far beyond them towards the east and northeast. This lost portion of the continent was the Atlantis of which the old annals of Egypt told so much in the time of Solon, as we learned from Plato, and it was the original seat of the first human civilization, which, after the great cataclysm, was renewed and perpetuated in the region where we now trace the mysterious remains of ancient cities. Those desiring to know what can be said in support of this view of ancient America must read the later volumes of Brasseur de Bourbourg, especially his Quatre Lettres sur le Mexique and his Sources de la Histoire primitive du Mexique, etc. He is not a perspicuous writer. He uses but little system in treating the subject, and he induces many fanciful speculations which do more to embarrass than to help the discussion. But those who read the books patiently can find and bring together all that relates to the point in question and consider it in their own way. They can also find it set forth and defended in a small volume by George Catlin entitled The Lifted and Subsided Rocks of America, published in London not long since by Trubner and Company. I shall give more attention to this theory in the next chapter. I refer to it here on account of the very great antiquity it claims for the ancient American civilization. It represents that the advanced human development whose crumbling monuments are now studied at Copan, Mitla, and Palenque antedates everything else in the human period of our globe, excepting perhaps an earlier time of barbarism and pastoral simplicity. That its history goes back through all the misty ages of prehistoric time to an unknown date previous to the beginning of such civilization in any part of the Old World. It is hardly possible to make it more ancient. American cities seen by Tyrians. The view just stated touches the imagination and stirs the feelings like a genuine wonder story. But this should not be allowed to deny it a fair hearing. Those who reject it should disprove it before they hasten to pronounce it absurd and impossible, else it may be suspected that their accustomed views of antiquity are due more to education and to the habit of following a given fashion of thinking than to actual reflection. It needs demonstration, and we may reasonably suggest that, in the present state of our knowledge of the past, demonstration is impossible. Meanwhile, a clear historical record appears to make it certain that flourishing towns and cities were seen and visited in America 3,000 years ago by persons who went to them across the Atlantic. It is said more or less clearly by more than one Greek writer that the Phoenicians and Carthaginians knew the way to a continent beyond the Atlantic. One fact preserved in the annals of Tyrian commerce and mentioned by several ancient writers is related by Diodorus Siculus, very particularly as a matter of authentic history. His narration begins with the following statement. Over against Africa lies a very great island in the vast ocean, many days' sail from Libya westward. The soil there is very fruitful, a great part whereof is mountainous, but much likewise champaign, which is the most sweet and pleasant part, for it is watered by several navigable streams, and beautified with many gardens of pleasure planted with divers sorts of trees, and an abundance of orchards. The towns are adorned with stately buildings and banqueting houses pleasantly situated in their gardens and orchards. The great ruins at Yucatan and elsewhere in Mexico and Central America bear witness that there was anciently such a country as this across the ocean, many days' sail from Libya westward. But Diodorus Siculus lived before the Christian era, and how was this known to him and others more than 1,500 years before America was discovered by Columbus? He tells us as follows. The Phoenicians, or Tyrians, having found out the coasts beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sailed along the coast of Africa. One of their ships on a sudden was driven by a furious storm far off into the main ocean. After they had lain under this violent tempest many days, they at length arrived at this island. This reminds us of the constrained voyage of Bjarni, the Northman, from Iceland to the coast of Massachusetts in the year 985 AD. He too was storm-driven many days, and in this way forced to the discovery of New England. He started for Greenland and finally reached it by way of Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. The tempest-driven ship of the Tyrians must have been carried to the West Indies and to the coast of Honduras or Yucatan, where the Tyrians saw the gardens, cities, and stately edifices. The description of what they saw brings to mind similar accounts of what was seen in Yucatan by the Spaniards when they began to sail along the coast of that peninsula in the beginning of the 16th century. Juan Diaz de Solis and Vicente Yanez Pincon in 1506, and Hernandez de Cordova in 1517. They too saw handsome towns and stately buildings. This undesigned voyage of the Tyrian ship seems to have been made previous to the building of Gadir or Gades. Perhaps they made other voyages to that region, but it was a custom of the Phoenicians to be very secret in regard to the methods and paths of their commerce. A complete history of their commerce and navigation from the earliest times would unquestionably give us views of the past quite as startling to the prevalent assuming, unreasoning habits of belief, or rather disbelief, concerning antiquity, as that hypothesis of Atlantis and the earliest civilization. What is told by Diodorus authorizes us to suppose that the Tyrians who went across the Atlantic as described beheld some of the ancient American cities which are now found in ruins, for it is certain that nothing of the kind existed anywhere else many days' sail from Libya or northern Africa westward. Their voyage was made more than 1,100 years previous to the Christian era, if the old Central American books may be trusted. This was not very long previous to the beginning of the Toltec domination. Beyond this date, the history of the Colhuas, who are described as the original civilizers, must have covered a very long period. How long we may imagine, but cannot know. Gadir, now Cadiz, founded 1,100 years previous to the Christian era, is still an inhabited city. It has been several times reconstructed, but never deserted. When it was built, Tartessus, then a very old city, still existed, although it was in ruins long before Christ appeared. How long had Palenque been in existence when that Tyrian ship was driven across the Atlantic? And how long had that region been a region of cities and civilization? There is no history which can answer these questions. 7. Whence came that old civilization? Various theories, some of them very wild and irrational, have been advanced to explain the origin of what is seen in these relics of ancient America. If it had been the fashion to explore and study them as their importance deserves, As Egypt and Nineveh have been explored and studied, our knowledge of them would now be much more extensive and valuable, and it might be possible to go farther towards a solution of the problem they present. But not many persons have sought to explore and understand these remains, and not more than 2 or 3 have really sought in earnest to examine the old traditions and books of the country. The abundant inscriptions at Palenque fade in their forest solitude while waiting for the Champollion who shall interpret their mysteries. Something is known, but we have no history of these old cities, no authentic historical record of these people who built them. Therefore, theorizing has very naturally been stimulated to great activity, and most of this theorizing has been regulated by the old, unreasoning assumption that civilization found in any place, especially in the olden times, must have been brought and established there as a foreign production. Generally, the hypothesis used in this case have presumed as a matter of course that the original civilizers came to this continent from Europe or Asia. The lost tribes of Israel. One of these theories is or was that the original civilizers of Mexico and Central America were the lost 10 tribes of Israel. This extremely remarkable explanation of the mystery was devised very early, and it has been persistently defended by some persons, although nothing can be more unwarranted or more absurd. It was put forward by the Spanish monks, who first established missions in the country, a class of men to whom the world is indebted for a great variety of amazing contributions to the literature of hagiology. And the same men, in a way equally conclusive, explain the sculptured crosses found in the old ruins by assuming that the gospel was preached in America by St. Thomas. Lord Kingsborough adopted their views and gave up nearly the whole of one of his immense volumes on Mexican antiquities to an elaborate digest of all that had been written to explain and support these absurdities. Others have maintained this Israelitish hypothesis without deeming it necessary to establish in a reasonable way what was possible to those Israelites. According to this truly monkish theory, the lost 10 tribes of Israel left Palestine, Syria, Assyria, or whatever country they dwelt in at the time, traversed the whole extent of Asia, crossed over into America at the Bering Strait, went down the Pacific coast, and established a wonderful civilization in that part of the continent where the great ruins are found. The kingdom of the 10 tribes was destroyed not long previous to the year 700 BC. How many years are allowed after their escape from captivity for this unparalleled journey has not been ascertained. But if such a journey had been possible, it would have resulted in utter barbarism rather than any notable phase of civilized life. Even the Jews, who remain faithful to Moses, although important on account of their scriptures and their religion, were not remarkable for civilization. They were incapable of building their own temple without aid from the Tyrians. Moreover, there is not anywhere either a fact, a suggestion, or a circumstance of any kind to show that the lost 10 tribes ever left the country of southwestern Asia where they dwelt after the destruction of their kingdom. They were lost to the Jewish nation because they rebelled, apostatized, and after their subjugation by the Assyrians in 721 BC, were to a great extent absorbed by other people in that part of Asia. Some of them probably were still in Palestine when Christ appeared. This wild notion, called a theory, scarcely deserves so much attention. It is a lunatic fantasy possible only to men of a certain class, which in our time does not multiply. The Malay theory. Another hypothesis, much less improbable, though not satisfactory, is that civilization was brought to America in ancient times by the Malays. There was a great island and empire of the Malays whose history extends far back into prehistoric times, How far back cannot now be known. It was still in existence when the Portuguese first went to India around the Cape of Good Hope, and we have several accounts of this empire written by travelers who saw and described it 600 years before this first Indian voyage of the Portuguese was undertaken. El-Masudi, who was one of these travelers, used very strong terms to describe its extent, intelligence, and power. Speaking of its sovereign, he said, "The islands under his scepter are so numerous that the fastest sailing vessel is not able to go around them in 2 years," implying that his sway was acknowledged by the island world over a large portion of the Pacific. This Malayan empire was maritime and commercial. It had fleets of great ships, and there is evidence that its influence reached most of the Pacific islands. This is shown by the fact that dialects of Malay language have been found in most of these islands as far in this direction as Easter Island. The language of the Sandwich Islanders, for instance, is Malayan and has a close relationship to that now spoken in the Malay Islands. The metropolis of this great empire was in the island of Java, where old ruins still bear witness of the former civilization, wealth, and splendor celebrated by El-Masudi. Mr. A.R. Wallace, in his work on the Malay archipelago, says, "Few Englishmen are aware of the number and beauty of the architectural remains in Java. They have never been popularly illustrated or described, and it will therefore take most persons by surprise to learn that they far surpass those of Central America, perhaps even those of India." The purpose of his visit to the island did not allow him to explore ruins, but he describes some of them. He saw what still remains of the ancient city called Mojo Pahit, and says, "There were 2 lofty brick masses, apparently the size of a gateway. The extreme perfection and beauty of the brickwork astonished me. The bricks are exceedingly fine and hard, with sharp angles and true surfaces. They were laid with great exactness, without visible mortar or cement, yet somehow fastened together so that the joints are hardly perceptible, and sometimes the 2 surfaces coalesce in a most incomprehensible manner. Such admirable brickwork I have never seen before or since. There was no sculpture here, but abundance of bold projections and finely worked moldings. Traces of buildings exist for many miles in every direction, and almost every road and pathway shows a foundation of brickwork beneath it, the paved roads of the old city." In other places, he saw sculptures and beautifully carved figures in high relief. The Malays still read and write, have some literature, and retain many of the arts and usages of civilization, but they are now very far below the condition indicated by these ruins and described by El-Masudi, who traveled among them 1,000 years ago. It is by no means improbable that their ships visited the western coast of America and traded with the ancient Mexicans and Peruvians in the days of their greatest power and activity. It is not easy to believe they could fail to do so after taking such control of Easter Island as to leave their language there, and according to the old traditions of both Mexico and Peru, the Pacific coast in both countries was anciently visited by a foreign people who came in ships. But they did not come to America as civilizers. There's nothing Malayan in either the antiquities or the ancient speech of these countries. What is known of the former great condition and power of the Malays furnishes important suggestions relative to the ancient history of the islands of Eastern Asia and the Pacific Ocean, as well as those of the Indian Ocean. The people who inhabit the eastern side of Formosa, it is said, use a Malay dialect and have no resemblance whatever to the Mongols. Who can fully explain the little-known Ainos, who formerly occupied the whole, or nearly the whole, of Japan? The unmistakable traces of Malay influence everywhere in the islands of the Pacific can have but one meaning. The Malays formerly sailed on the ocean, occupied its islands, and doubtless visited America. That there was communication between Eastern Asia and America in very ancient times through the Malays or otherwise is in a high degree probable. This continent was known to the Japanese and Chinese long before the time of Columbus. Accounts of it were recorded in their books previous to this time. They called it V-VII, and evidently at some period had been accustomed to make voyages to some part of the American coast. But neither the Malays, the Chinese, nor the Japanese came here as civilizers, for there is no trace of either of those people in the old ruins, in the ancient language of the country, or in anything we know of the people whom these American ruins represent. The Phoenician theory. Some of the more intelligent investigators have maintained with no little confidence that this ancient American civilization came originally from the Phoenicians. Among those who use reason in their inquiries sufficiently to be incapable of accepting the absurdities of monkish fancy, this hypothesis has found more favor than any other. Wherever inquiry begins by assuming that the original civilizers came from some other part of the world, it seems more reasonable than any other, for more can be said to give it the appearance of probability. The people known to us as Phoenicians were preeminent in the colonizing navigators of antiquity. They were an enlightened and enterprising maritime people whose commerce traversed every known sea and extended its operations beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the great exterior ocean. The early Greeks called them Ethiopians, not meaning either black men nor Africans, and said that they were everywhere, establishing their colonies and their commerce in all the coast regions, from the extreme east to the extreme west. But the great ages of this people are in the distant past, far beyond the beginning of what we call history. History has knowledge only of a few of their later communities, the Sabians of southern Arabia, the Phoenicians, meaning chiefly the Tyrians, and the Carthaginians. What a change there would be in the prevalent conceptions of the past if we could have a complete record of this race from the beginning of its development. It is not difficult to believe that communities of the Phoenician or Ethiopian race were established all around the Mediterranean and even beyond the Straits of Gibraltar in ages quite as old as Egypt or Chaldea, and that they had communication with America before Tyre or Sidon was built. Why did the ancients say so much of a great Saturnian continent beyond the Atlantic if nobody in the prehistoric ages had ever seen that continent? It was there, as they said it was, we know. But whence came their knowledge of it, and such knowledge as led them to describe it as larger than Asia, meaning Asia Minor, Europe and Libya together? This ancient belief must have been due to Phoenician or Ethiopian communication with America in earlier times, which was imperfectly recollected or perhaps never completely revealed to other nations, and this must have taken place at a very remote period, for imperfect recollection of the great continent across the Atlantic, including what Solon heard in Egypt of Atlantis, was more ancient than that constrained voyage of that Tyrian ship of which Diodorus Siculus gives an account, and it can be seen that the early Greeks had a better knowledge even of Western Europe than those of later times. A dark age, so far as relates to geographical knowledge, set it upon the countries around the Aegean Sea and on the coast of Asia Minor after the independence and enterprise of Tyre and the other Phoenician cities were destroyed by the Assyrians towards the close of the 9th century before Christ, which was disturbed some 450 or 500 years later by the conquests of Alexander the Great. The known enterprise of the Phoenician race and this ancient knowledge of America, so variously expressed, strongly encouraged the hypothesis that the people called Phoenicians came to this continent, established colonies in the region where ruined cities are found, and filled it with civilized life. It is argued that they made voyages on the great exterior ocean, and that such navigators must have crossed the Atlantic, and it is added that symbolic devices similar to those of the Phoenicians are found in the American ruins, and that an old tradition of the native Mexicans and Central Americans describe the first civilizers as bearded white men who came from the east in ships. Therefore, it is urged the people described in the native books and traditions as Calhuas must have been Phoenicians. But if it were true that the civilization found in Mexico and Central America came from the people of the Phoenician race, it would be true also that they built in America as they never built anywhere else, that they established a language here radically unlike their own, and that they used a style of writing totally different from that which they carried into every other region occupied by their colonies. All the forms of alphabetical writing used at present in Europe and southwestern Asia came directly or indirectly from that anciently invented by the race to which the Phoenicians belonged, and they have traces of a common relationship which can easily be detected. Now, the writing of the inscriptions at Palenque, Copan, and elsewhere in the ruins has no more relatedness to the Phoenician than to the Chinese writing. It has not a single characteristic that can be called Phoenician any more than the language of the inscriptions or the style of architecture with which it is associated. Therefore, we cannot reasonably suppose this American civilization was originated by people of the Phoenician race, whatever may be thought relative to the supposed ancient communication between the two continents and its probable influence on civilized communities already existing here. The Atlantic theory. I have already stated in general terms the hypothesis advanced by Brasseur de Bourberg and some other writers. This may be called the Atlantic theory, for it attributes the civilization of ancient America to the Atlantides or Atlantic race, who occupied the lost island of Atlantis. Brasseur de Bourberg has studied the monuments, writings, and traditions left by this civilization more carefully and thoroughly than any other man living. He has fancies which may be safely rejected, and he has theories which doubtless will always lack confirmation. But he has much, also, which demands respectful consideration. There is a great deal in his books to provoke criticism. Those well acquainted with the antiquities and ancient speech of Egypt may reasonably give way to a smile of incredulity while reading what he says in support of the notion that the great civilization of Egypt also came originally from this Atlantic race. Nevertheless, his volumes are important because they furnish materials which others can use more carefully, and because he has learned to decipher some of the Central American writings and brought to view certain paths of inquiry which others may pursue with a more rigid method. As already stated, his Atlantic theory of the old American civilization is that it was originated on this continent, but on a portion of the continent which is now below the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It supposes the continent extended anciently from New Granada, Central America, and Mexico in a long, irregular peninsula so far across the Atlantic that the Canary, Madeira, and Azores, or Western Islands, may be remains of this portion of it. High mountains stood where we now find the West India Islands. Beyond those, towards Africa and Europe, was a great extent of fertile and beautiful land, and here arose the first civilization of mankind, which flourished many ages until at length this extended portion of the continent was engulfed by a tremendous convulsion of nature, or by a succession of such convulsions which made the ruin complete. After the cataclysm, a part of the Atlantic people who escaped destruction settled in Central America, where perhaps their civilization had been previously introduced. The reasons urged in support of this hypothesis make it seem plausible, if not probable, to imaginative minds. In the first place, Brasseur de Bowerberg claims that there is in the old Central American books a constant tradition of an immense catastrophe of the character supposed, that this tradition existed everywhere among the people when they first became known to Europeans, and that recollections of the catastrophe were preserved in some of their festivals, especially in one celebrated in the month of Izcalli, which was instituted to commemorate this frightful destruction of land and people, and in which princes and people humbled themselves before the divinity and besought him to withhold a return of such terrible calamities. This tradition affirms that a part of the continent extended into the Atlantic was destroyed in the manner supposed, and appears to indicate that the destruction was accomplished by a succession of frightful convulsions. 3 are constantly mentioned, and sometimes there is mention of 1 or 2 others. The land was shaken by frightful earthquakes, and the waves of the sea combined with volcanic fires to overwhelm and engulf it. Each convulsion swept away portions of the land until the whole disappeared, leaving the line of the coast as it is now. Most of the inhabitants, overtaken amid their regular employments, were destroyed. But some escaped in ships, and some fled for safety to the summits of high mountains, or to portions of land which for the time escaped immediate destruction. Quotations are made from the old books in which this tradition is recorded, which appear to verify his report of what is found in them. To criticize intelligently his interpretation of their significance, one needs to have a knowledge of those books and traditions equal at least to his own. In the second place, he appeals to the story of Atlantis, preserved in the annals of Egypt and related to Ceylon by the priests of Sais. It is stated in Plutarch's Life of Ceylon that while in Egypt, he conferred with the priests of Cenophis, Sonchis, Heliopolis, and Sais, and learned from them the story of Atlantis. Brasseur de Bowerberg cites Cousin's translation of Plato's record of this story as follows. Among the great deeds of Athens, of which recollection is preserved in our books, there is one which should be placed above all others. Our books tell the Athenians destroyed an army which came across the Atlantic Sea and insolently invaded Europe and Asia. For this sea was then navigable, and beyond the strait where you placed the Pillars of Hercules, there was an island, larger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. From this island, one could pass easily to the other islands, and from these to the continent which lies around the interior sea. The sea on this side of the strait, the Mediterranean, of which we speak, resembles a harbor with a narrow entrance, but there is a genuine sea, and the land which surrounds it is a veritable continent. In the island of Atlantis reigned 3 kings with great and marvelous power. They had under their dominion the whole of Atlantis, several other islands, and some parts of the continent. At one time, their power extended into Libya and into Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, and uniting their whole force, they sought to destroy our countries at a blow, but their defeat stopped the invasion and gave entire independence to all the countries on this side of the Pillars of Hercules. Afterward, in one day and one fatal night, there came mighty earthquakes and inundations which engulfed that warlike people. Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea, and then that sea became inaccessible, so that navigation on it ceased on account of the quantity of mud which the engulfed island left in its place. This invasion took place many ages before Athens was known as a Greek city. It is referred to in extremely remote antiquity. The festival known as the Lesser Panathenæ, which, as symbolic devices used in its show, commemorated this triumph over the Atlantes. It is said to have been instituted by the mythical Erichthonius in the earliest times remembered by Athenian tradition. Solon had knowledge of the Atlantes before he went to Egypt, but he heard there for the first time this account of their island and of its disappearance in a frightful cataclysm. But Atlantis is mentioned by other ancient writers. An extract preserved in Proclus, taken from a work now lost, which is quoted by Boeck in his commentary on Plato, mentions islands in the exterior sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and says it was known that in one of these islands, the inhabitants preserved from their ancestors a remembrance of Atlantis, an extremely large island, which for a long time held dominion over all the islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Brasseur de Bowerberg claims that these traditions on both sides of the Atlantic mean the same thing. The island of Atlantis, larger than Libya and Asia Minor together, was the extended portion of the American continent. These concurring traditions cannot be devoid of historical significance. The constant references by ancient Greek writers to the Atlantes, who are always placed at the extremity of Europe and Africa on the ocean which bears their name, may reasonably be regarded as vague and faded recollections of such an historical history connected with that ocean as that implied by what was said of their island in the annals of Egypt. In support of this view of what is meant by the traditions, he adds this philological argument. The words Atlas and Atlantic have no satisfactory etymology in any language known to Europe. They are not Greek and cannot be referred to in any known language of the Old World. But in the Nahuatl language, we find immediately the radical atl, which signifies water, war, and the top of the head. From this comes a series of words such as Atlan, on the border of or amid the water, from which we have the adjective Atlantic. We have also atlaka, to combat or be in agony. It means likewise to hurl or dart from the water, and in the preterite makes Atlas. A city named Atlan existed when the continent was discovered by Columbus at the entrance of the Gulf of Urubá in Darien, with a good harbor. It is now reduced to an unimportant pueblo named Akla. In the third place, he quotes opinions expressed without any regard whatever to his theory to show that scientific men who have considered the question believe that there was formerly a great extension of the land into the Atlantic in the manner supposed. The first quotation is from Moreau de Sainte-Marie's Description topographique et politique de la partie espagnole à l'île de Saint-Dominique, published in 1796 as follows. There are those who, in examining the map of America, do not confine themselves to thinking with the French Pliny that the innumerable islands situated from the mouth of the Orinoco to the Bahama Channel, islands which include several Grenadians not always visible in the very high tides or great agitations of the sea, should be considered as summits of vast mountains whose bases and sides are covered with water, but who go farther and suppose these islands to be the tops of the most elevated of a chain of mountains which crowned a portion of the continent whose submersion has produced the Gulf of Mexico. But to sustain this opinion, it must be added that another vast surface of land which united the islands of this archipelago to the continent from Yucatan to the mouth of the Orinoco was submerged in the same way, and also a third surface which connected them with the peninsula of Florida and with whatever land may have constituted the northern termination, for we cannot imagine that these mountains, whose summits appear above water, stood on the terminating line of the continent. He quotes also another authority which cannot be suspected, namely M. Charles Martins, who said, in the Revue des Deux Mondes for March 1st, 1867, "Now, hydrography, geology, and botany agree in teaching us that the Azores, the Canaries, and Madeira are the remains of a great continent which formerly united Europe to North America." He could have added other quotations in the same strain. Those geologists who believe that our continents have long remained in nearly the same relative position would probably give the supposed change a much greater antiquity than Brasseur de Bourberg would be likely to accept, and the geological uniformitarians would deny with emphasis that so great a change in the shape of a continent was ever effected by such means or with such rapidity as he supposes. But the latest and most advanced school of geological speculation does not exclude catastrophism, and therefore will not deny the possibility of sudden and great changes by this method. Doubtless, the antiquity of the human race is much greater than is usually assumed by those whose views of the past are still regulated by medieval systems of chronology. Archaeology and linguistic science, not to speak here of geology, make it certain that the period between the beginning of the human race and the birth of Christ would be more accurately stated if the centuries counted in the longest estimate of the rabbinical chronologies should be changed to millenniums. And they present also another fact, namely, that the antiquity of civilization is very great, and suggests that in remote ages it may have existed with important developments in regions of the earth now described as barbarous, and even as Brasseur de Bourberg supposes, on ancient continents or portions of continents now out of sight below the surface of the oceans. The representation of some speculators that the condition of the human race since its first appearance on Earth has been a condition of universal and hopeless savagery down to a comparatively modern date is an assumption merely, an unwarranted assumption, used in support of an unproved and unprovable theory of man's origin. It is used in the name of science by advocates of this theory, like the theory itself, shows the constructive power of fancy and imagination will sometimes supersede everything else, and substitute its ingenious constructions for legitimate conclusions, even in scientific speculation. We may claim reasonably that Brasseur de Bourberg's Atlantic theory is not proved, and on this ground refuse to accept it. So far as appears, it is a fanciful theory which cannot be proved. No one is under obligation to attempt disproving it. It may in some cases win supporters by enlisting in its favor all the forces of imagination, to which it appeals with seductive plausibility. On the other hand, it will be rejected without much regard to what can be said in its favor, for it interferes with current unreasoning beliefs concerning antiquity and ancient history, and must encounter vehement contradiction from habits of thought fixed by these beliefs. True, some of the stock views of antiquity by which it will be earnestly opposed are themselves far more destitute of foundation in either fact or reason, but this will make no difference, as the habit of never allowing them to be subjected to the searching power of reason does not permit such persons either to believe or deny anything connected with this topic in a reasonable manner. Some of the uses made of this theory cannot endure criticism. For instance, when he makes it the basis of an assumption that all the civilization of the Old World went originally from America, and claims particularly that the supposed Atlantic race created Egypt, he goes quite beyond reach of the considerations used to give his hypothesis a certain air of probability. It may be, as he says, that for every pyramid in Egypt there are 1,000 in Mexico and Central America, but the ruins in Egypt and those in America have nothing in common. The two countries were entirely different in their language, in their styles of architecture, in their written characters, and in the physical characteristics of their earliest people, as they are seen sculptured or painted on the monuments. An Egyptian pyramid is no more the same thing as a Mexican pyramid than a Chinese pagoda is the same thing as an English lighthouse. It was not made in the same way nor for the same uses. The rune monuments show in general and in particulars that the original civilizers in America were profoundly different from the ancient Egyptians. The two people cannot explain each other. This, however, does not require us to assert positively that the Central American Calhuas and the legendary Atlantes could not possibly have been the same people or people of the same race. Room may be left for any amount of conjecture not inconsistent with known facts, without making it necessary to accept a theory of the origin of the old Mexican race which at present can neither be proved nor disproved. It was an original civilization. It has been said, very justly, by one explorer of the Mexican and Central American ruins that the American monuments are different from those of any other known people of a new order and entirely and absolutely anomalous. They stand alone. The more we study them, the more we find it necessary to believe that the civilization they represent was originated in America, and probably in the region where they are found. It did not come from the old world. It was the work of some remarkably gifted branch of the race found on the southern part of this continent when it was discovered in 1492. Undoubtedly, it was very old. Its original beginning may have been as old as Egypt or even farther back in the past than the ages to which Atlantis must be referred. And it may have been later than the beginning of Egypt. Who can certainly tell its age? Whether earlier or later, it was original. Its construction seemed to have been a refined and artistic development of a style of building different from that of any other people, which began with ruder forms, but in all the periods of its history preserved the same general conception. They show us the idea of the mound builders wrought out in stone and embellished by art. The decorations and the writings also are wholly original. There is no imitation of the work of any people ever known in Asia, Africa, or Europe. It appears evident that the method of building seen in the great ruins began with the ruder forms of mound work and became what we find by gradual development as the advancing civilization supplied new ideas and gave higher skill. But the culture and the work were wholly original, wholly American. The civilized life of the ancient Mexicans and Central Americans may have had its original beginning somewhere in South America, for they seem more closely related to the ancient South Americans than to the wild Indians north of the Mexican border. But the peculiar development of it represented by the ruins must have begun in the region where they are found. I find myself more and more inclined to the opinion that the aboriginal South Americans are the oldest people on this continent, that they are distinct in race, and that the wild Indians of the north came originally from Asia, where the race to which they belong seems still represented by the Koraks and Chukchis, found in that part of Asia which extends to Bering's Strait. If, as there is reason to believe, the countries on the Mediterranean had communication with America in very ancient times, they found here a civilization already developed and contributed nothing to change its style of building and decorating cities. They may have influenced it in other respects, for if such communication was opened across the Atlantic, It was probably continued for a long time, and its interruption may or may not be due, as Brasseur de Bowerberg supposes, to the cataclysm which engulfed Atlantis. Religious symbols are found in the American ruins which remind us of those of the Phoenicians, such as figures of the serpent which appear constantly, and the cross supposed by some to represent the mounting of the magnetic needle, which was among the emblems peculiar to the goddess Astarte. A figure appears occasionally in the sculptures in which some have sought to recognize Astarte, one at Palenque being described as follows. It is a female figure, molded in stucco, holding a child in her left arm and hand, just as Astarte appears on the Sidonian medals. I find it impossible to see that this figure has any resemblance whatever to the Phoenician goddess. They are not alike either in dress, posture, or expression. Dupuy describes it correctly in saying it represents a person apparently absorbed in devotion, a worshipper and not a goddess. Moreover, Astarte usually appears in the medals standing on the forward deck of a vessel, holding a cross with one hand and pointing forward with the other. And finally, this figure seems to represent not a woman, but a priest. There was sun worship in America, and the phallic ceremonies existed in some places in the time of Cortez. In Asia, the ceremonies and figures of the serpent were usually associated with sun worship. Humboldt was sure that these symbols came to America from the Old World. A more careful study of the subject might have led him to modify his belief. But whether we adopt his explanation or some other, the traditions on both sides of the Atlantic are without meaning unless it be admitted that there was communication between the two continents in times of which we have no history.